Hello and welcome to the 3D Blu-ray Bunker. This is a place for us die-hard fans of 3D where we exclusively look at 3D Blu-rays, not to review the film but to almost entirely focus on the quality of the 3D on offer, with just a short comment at the end about the film itself. And today we're looking at Dredd from 2012. This was the second attempt to bring the legendary 2000 AD comic anti-hero to the screen, and it's a very different film to the generally disliked and dismissed Sylvester Stallone effort from the mid-90s. The aspect ratio is 2.4 to 1, and this was a native 3D production, so filmed with 3D camera rigs. And at the time this was made, being made in native 3D maybe wasn't as big a deal as it became, because in the early part of the decade, lots of films were still being made that way, and for 3D purists, this was always a sign that it would be a superior 3D experience to those nasty, newfangled post-converted efforts. And I know this is a film that a lot of 3D fans have rated very highly over the years, which is always another good sign, although I expect you've come across 3D fans whose opinions you generally agree with, but where occasionally you might find yourselves at odds with them, and once in a while you may feel like a bit of a lone voice with your opinion. Possible spoiler alert there. So it's fairly normal, almost obligatory in fact, for a 3D film to throw its title at you, and Dredd does a fantastic job of that. It's huge and it's got a blast of debris surrounding it, and so this suggests that these guys love 3D and that they're going to make the most of it. A couple of early exterior shots have a nice sense of depth to them, and I always like the view from low down across a flat plain to the distance, and this is quite a nice example of that. The establishing view of the city has really nice depth and separation. They've pushed the 3D somewhere beyond the natural human view, which always works well with cityscapes, and a view I'm always a big fan of is the view down onto buildings, especially tall ones like these. It makes for great 3D, and this is quite a nice view, so it's all looking good. And I've got no problem with in-movie screen views like this one being flat. They seem to have predicted here, quite rightly as it turned out, that future TVs won't be 3D, although here they haven't done what films often do with their views of screens, which is to raise the information overlay above the level of the screen. So that makes sense, even if it's a little bit dull from a 3D point of view. Oddly though, we do get a lot of views of the building's CCTV screens where they do bring the text overlay out in front of the plane of the screen, so that seems like a little bit of a minor inconsistency there. The majority of the film is set inside a massive slum tower mega block, and it's really, once we get inside here, which happens very early, and it's for the most part this is where we stay throughout the whole film, that I think the 3D largely disappoints. If you're a fan of negative parallax where things pop out of the screen, then this film won't deliver the sort of 3D thrills that you like. It's a movie where there are a lot of guns, and they managed to deliver the obvious 3D gun shot at least once. Actually, I think it really is literally just once, and here is Dredd's gun poking out of the screen. In this similar shot though, there's no pop out whatsoever. Everything's behind the screen. I always try to keep in mind I'm just an idiot watching the film and giving it a few minutes thought, whereas everyone involved spent a chunk of their lives putting it together, and they made it look exactly the way they wanted it to look. So I'm really loath to say what I'm about to say, but to me this shot just makes it look like they didn't know what they were doing. You know, why not keep the gun and his hand within the frame and make it pop out of the screen? So, you know, okay, so they've decided, they've made it very clear that the 3D in this film isn't really going to be about pop out, even though there is some. But if you're making a comic book film and shooting it natively, and having 3D baked into the title of the film even, surely you could let a moment like this one deliver pop out fans a brief moment, you know, throw us a scrap. But nothing wrong at all with a film featuring depth over pop-out. It's the more respectable sort of thing, avoiding gimmick shots and delivering some great depth to draw us into the image instead. And that's my preference for 3D anyway. Unfortunately though, I think that Dredd pretty much fails on that front too. I know this was shot with 3D rigs, but if I hadn't known that, for large parts of the film I would have assumed it was just a mediocre conversion. In fact, I'm convinced that that's what some of it is. This shot of Dredd looks wrong to me. It seems to have an error that you wouldn't get if you filmed with a twin camera setup, but you could get if it was sloppily converted, and that error to my eyes is that the light out of focus vertical part of the wall on the right hand side of the frame, along with the darker part to its left, is obviously further down the Z-axis than Dredd is, but that obviously looks like it doesn't make any sense, as it would mean half of his body is missing. It's odd, and I don't really know what's going on here. And also the shot of Dredd here behind some safety glass, it looks like a nice little piece of stereo composition, but the mesh grid inside the glass looks like it's in exactly the same place as his face, in other words flat. So again, I don't know how you'd achieve that if you're filming it natively. It's one of those films where there are many times where you might find yourself wondering whether a shot is in 3D or 2D, which is always a bad sign. This one, for example, had zero discernible depth in it, which if you point a 3D camera at this scene, you really can't help but getting some stereoscopic effect. It's such a shame that there are so many scenes that are really well designed for 3D. The composition throughout appears to be really nicely laid out precisely for the benefit of 3D. And if I'd watched this film for the first time in 2D, knowing that it was filmed in 3D, I'd be convinced that it would look fantastic because of the excellent composition that fills the space from the foreground to the background a lot of the time. Like these banks of people in front of their monitors. There are maybe, I don't know, 10 rows of them. It could look excellent, but it really doesn't. Here's a shot that looks to me like it was obviously arranged for the benefit of 3D, and this one actually works reasonably well with all of the wires hanging in the space above Donald Gleason here at a point where you'd expect them to be. These bikes, on the other hand, apart from the one in the foreground, all look completely flat and in the same plane. So strictly speaking, the shot is clearly in 3D, but it's really weak and uninspiring 3D and nowhere near as good as I think it could be, which sums up a lot of the film for me. Same for this shot. Dredd and the other two in the foreground are clearly in front of the crowd, but the crowd itself is completely flat. Look at crowd shots in something like The Walk, which is a post-converted film, where there's depth, space and solidity within crowd scenes. So again, this makes it look, to me, more like a weak post-conversion, and one where nobody involved was really all that interested. And here's another oddity. It looks like the camera is right up close to the balcony guard, if that's what this bit of metal is, but Dredd and the mess of bodies hardly look like they're any further back. Or when he's in this cage, there's also only the tiniest amount of depth behind the bars when you'd reasonably expect this to be an opportunity for good 3D. And worse still, here's a shot beautifully designed for 3D. It's a top-down view with some perspective lines from the walls at the edge of the screen, and even better, the body's lying on a grid floor with the background far beyond it. And it's a shot like this that looks immaculately composed for 3D, which is why it's so disappointing that they look as if they've only achieved a tiny amount of depth. You can just imagine the various trails coming off this explosion having discernible amounts of solidity to them, and if they hadn't had the guy in the foreground, it could have even been a chance to break out of the screen with some pop-out. But not only is there no pop-out, but the explosion actually looks two-dimensional in this shot. Trying to be a bit more positive, due to the nature of the tower block setting, there are multiple views up the core of the building, down the core, up lift shafts, down corridors, all of which have a massive amount of natural perspective, and at first it looks like these are a handful of the film's genuinely impressive 3D moments, except I'm not actually convinced that they are, and the more times they use these views, the more I started to think that the actual stereoscopy is in fact quite mild. It's the natural extreme perspective of the shot that sort of flatters to deceive, and it fools the brain into thinking it's great 3D. It's not terrible, but I don't think it's amazing. The best shots looking down the floors are the ones where they're filled with loads of particles, and the separation here is actually really pleasing. This is one of the better bits of 3D in the film. And similarly, these shots are also really good, but it's the particles, which were presumably added in digitally long after they'd packed away their 3D camera, that make them look good. These shots also look good because, and this is a story point within the film, it's to do with a drug called slow-mo, which is a great invention for a 3D film because I think 3D can be at its most impressive in slow motion. One of the reasons I love 3D photography as much as 3D films, actually possibly even more so, is the way that it allows to lose yourself in the depth of the shot without being sort of fast edited onto the next one. And Dredd's slow motion is excellent from that point of view. I think these are the shots that won over a lot of the 3D admirers of this film, but from my point of view, a few great 3D shots in an otherwise fairly flat film is nothing like good enough. I'll put up this last shot as it's maybe my favourite bit of 3D in the film. It's very brief and very minor, and if I'm honest, it's not exactly a state-of-the-art bit of 3D, but because it comes after so much mediocre and almost two-dimensional stuff, it actually startled me when it appeared. But of course, some 3D films have 3D as good as this shot for the entirety of the film. So, from a 3D point of view, I wouldn't really recommend Dredd, especially to anyone who's not familiar with 3D films, as it's the kind of thing that I think could put them off laugh for life. It seems to be slightly ironic that they appear to have gone out of their way to avoid obvious 3D gimmick pop-out shots, but in using good 3D really for only a few specific sequences, it ends up, I think, being an even more gimmicky use of the process. For those of us hunting down whatever releases there are out there and have experienced the highs and lows of the format, it's obviously worth a look at this one, but overall I'd class this as mostly disappointing, especially for an apparently native production. So a very brief word on the film, and I'm delighted to say that after all that negativity that I really like this film. It's got a great look to it, it's got good cinematography, although actually there is quite a bit of ugly digital noise in lots of scenes, but it's grimy, it's gritty and it's bloody, and Carl Urban plays it straight, even with that sort of perma-grimace, and he does a good job, particularly being that he never takes his helmet off. Olivia Thirlby is likeable as the rookie, although I wasn't so keen on the psychic abilities that she has. They don't seem to fit in with the type of science fiction film I thought this was, but maybe that's in the comics, which I've never read. Lena Headey's a good villain, and I think I mentioned him earlier, but it's good to see an earlier appearance from Donald Gleeson. It might look at times like it's taking some ideas and even some lines from RoboCop, but the Judge Dredd comic predates Paul Verhoeven's masterpiece by about a decade, and the makers of this film, particularly the excellent writer Alex Garland, presumably wanted to slyly draw attention to that. At about an hour and a half, it doesn't have time to get boring, which is all the more impressive given it's locked in into the single location. So a really good film, but really not good 3D. So I hope you found this in some way useful, and if so, I hope you'll join me again soon for another 3D Blu-ray review. Until then, thanks for looking in on this one. Cheers for now. Bye-bye.